Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this month's Parent University. We're excited to share this information with you tonight as we get ready to close up schools for the winter break. It'll give us an opportunity to take stock of the things that are important when we come back in January. Tonight, we're going to be providing some information in reference to partnering to support our student behavioral needs and empowering all of us to be able to support them in the best possible way. We're very pleased you're able to join us. And as with every meeting that we actually start, we're going to begin with our district mission and vision. Our mission is to empower leaders who impact the now and innovate the future. And we truly work to adhere to that type of belief. And we think everyone is part of that group of leaders. That would include our students, our staff, and our community. We have 4 focus areas: student learning, student experience, communications, and finance. And those are the 4 pillars that drive our strategic plan. Tonight's event is just one more opportunity for us to connect with our community and to give you a sense of what happens in schools, how we go about facilitating, dealing with discipline issues, and making sure you understand how that process looks and what role you can play in making sure we're all successful together. I'll turn it over to Mr. Baker, our assistant superintendent, who will be our MC for tonight.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for that welcome. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being a part of our event tonight. Our agenda for this evening is there on the screen. You can see the things we're going to be covering. We're going to talk a little about the purpose of Parent University, first of all, and we'll address our outcomes for the evening. Then we're going to kick things off with our Chief Academic Officer and representative from our Center for Deeper Learning. We all know when it comes to student behavior, probably the best way to be proactive with student behavior is high engagement in the classroom. And so we want you as parents and caregivers to know what we are doing here to try to strengthen that engagement that we have within our classrooms. So we're going to talk a little bit about how Ohio's academic content standards align with our district's Portrait of a Graduate. Then we're going to hear from some of our building leaders who are going to talk about how they are managing positive behaviors within their buildings. We have representatives from all 3 of our levels and building leaders who are going to share those efforts with you. I'm going to talk a little bit about our Student Code of Conduct and how that is organized so that you as parents and caregivers can understand how it is set up and you understand how the rules are in place and how we make those big decisions when it comes to behavior. And then finally, we're going to hear from some of our partners. We have partners from our legal counsel who are going to talk about due process rights that families and students have when it comes to student behaviors. And then also hear from our fabulous partners at Nationwide Children's Hospital on how you as parents can best support your students and your kids as those behaviors arise and how you can support them through those situations. As always, when it comes to Parent University, we begin with our purpose. Really, I want to get into those outcomes, actually. Our purpose, of course, is to partner with our families and ensure that we have that strong partnership to support kids and make sure they're successful. Our outcomes for tonight are really to understand how those academic content standards align with our Portrait of a Graduate competencies so we can, again, increase that level of engagement within our schools. We want our participants tonight to understand how schools manage behavior through PBIS, which is short for, it's an acronym for Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports. It's a program that is defined in state law that schools have to do. But good schools have been doing this for a long, long time in terms of reinforcing those behaviors we want to see. We're also going to, again, we want our participants to understand those due process rights as well as what constitutes suspendable and expellable offenses here in Reynoldsburg City Schools. With that, I'm going to turn things over to our Chief Academic Officer, Dr. Jocelyn Cosgrave, and one of our coordinators from our Center for Deeper Learning, Micah Conley, who are going to talk to you about Ohio's learning standards and that alignment with our Portrait of a Graduate.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Tonight we just wanted to give a quick overview about deeper learning and what that looks like in the classroom for us right now. So as Mr. Baker talked about earlier, although this presentation is around student behavior and supports for student behavior, we firmly believe that the purpose of the work we do in classrooms is to engage students And so the way that we do that is through deeper learning in our district. So this visual that you have on the slide just kind of shows you our definition of deeper learning. So we take 21st century skills, which we'll talk about in just a moment, and rigorous academic content, and we combine those into units of deeper learning for our students. So a long time ago, when school happened and we were all in school, a lot of times we were really only busy learning content, how to do math, how to write papers in English and do grammar. We learned about social studies content and things like that. We're still doing those things, but we are combining that with skills that we also know are important for students in college and careers. And we also know that some other pieces of deeper learning is what really engages our students. And it helps us keep students engaged in the classroom so that they are excited to be at school. You can go to the next slide, Mr. Baker. So quite a few years ago, when we were engaging in the process of starting our strategic plan, one of the things that we noticed in many classrooms across the district is that our students were not authentically engaged in learning. We have wonderful students, and many times they were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing by sitting in rows and filling out worksheets and taking quizzes and tests. But, you know, one of the most powerful things that we did is we were exploring options for our academic plan related to our strategic plan is we, a bunch of us, principals, and at the time, some folks from central office, we took it upon ourselves to go observe a student for an entire day. And so we shadowed a student from the time that they got off of the bus until the time that they left for the day, just so that we could be in their shoes. And one of the things that came out to us clearly is that we were not authentically engaging our students. Most of their day was spent sitting in a seat still without collaborating with peers, without learning from one another and listening, and then filling out paperwork. And we all know as adults in the workforce, that is not always the case of how we interact. And so we had a problem to solve. Not all of our students were engaged in learning. And so we chose deeper learning as a way to address this issue. There's an abundance of research that tells us that engaging students in deeper learning is worth our time, talents, and energy. And later on, we will be sending this presentation out, and each of these links here will take you to articles that kind of expand on this idea. We also knew that our students needed skills, not just content, to be successful in college and careers. And we'll show you what those skills are in just a moment. We came together as a community with parents and students and teachers and administrators to come up with our portrait of a graduate competencies that represent the 21st century skills that we try to instill in our students every day. We also know that deeper learning closes opportunity gaps. And this is an idea that we talk about a lot in our district as we are planning everything from teaching and learning, but also to behavioral and social emotional supports. We have to make sure that most of the students in our district are having similar enough opportunities that they can be successful, and then we provide support when they need it. And then we also know that deeper learning closes achievement gaps. There is research time after time that shows that students are engaged in authentic learning tasks are going to do better on tests like the ACT and the SAT and also state tests, because they are learning to be problem solvers. They are learning to be thinkers. They are learning to think outside of the box, which are all skills that you would need when you're taking those high stakes tests. And then finally, we also know that deeper learning most resembles the real world. Very few of us get to attend jobs every day, where as long as we know the content or like the topics that we deal with every day, as long as we know that, we can keep our job. We have to know how to talk to people. We have to know how to empathize with people, collaborate with people. We have to be thinkers and problem solvers ourselves. And so we know that those things are also things that we want to foster in our students when they're with us. And so with all of that, we chose deeper learning as the way that we would tackle our issue of student engagement, in hopes that we could support the whole child, in hopes that we could help our students stay more engaged so that they're more likely to behave when they're in school with us. So next, I will turn it over to Micah Conley. She's going to talk a little bit more thoroughly about what rigorous academic content we have and resources to support that. And then also the thing we're most excited about that you might be familiar with now that you've seen it on your child's report card, and that's our Portrait of a Graduate competencies.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. When we start talking about rigorous academic content and think about deeper learning and Portrait of a Graduate, it seems like we start kind of spinning our wheels, and it seems like there's a lot going on. But what we've done and what Reynoldsburg has done a great job with is taking the pieces of academics and really thinking, when we reached out to buy resources and purchase experiences for our kids, that we purchase things that would support deeper learning. It would support an environment where students are able to work together, to collaborate with one another, that we were trying to get real life information and real life experiences into the classroom as much as possible. So, for example, Number Corner is a math resource that we purchased because it is focused around conversation. It's focused around group work. It's focused around students communicating with one another. It's not a worksheet that they're sitting and doing in isolation by themselves. When we purchase Fontes and Pinnell resources, we purchase those resources because they do the same thing. It sets up a situation where students are learning about content in the real world around them. It's going to set up situations for them to be in small groups and speaking with one another and not working in silos. And we think that when we're pulling out those resources and information into our classrooms, if it's engaging, if it's important to kids, we're going to lessen the behavior issues that we have. Go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. So as we start talking about the Portrait of a Graduate, which this is my favorite part of what we're doing right now, and I never as a teacher thought I would move to thinking that this type of skill was so important. And now that I see it, I can't unsee it. So I hope, parents, that this is something that you really gain some understanding and knowledge about and see that how great it is for our kids. So the Portrait of a Graduate are the 5 competencies that we believe as a district that create skills for kids that help them be successful in the classroom. These skills help them be successful in college, in the workforce, in their relationships with friends, and their relationships as they grow into adults. They're skills that make people happier, better people. So what we have done is created this Portrait of a Graduate and started incorporating these competencies into our lesson planning. So we're very conscious about thinking about students' social and emotional competency. Are they able to communicate and build relationships with other kids? And if not, what are we doing about that? And when we start looking at if they're effectively communicating, are they having a better, more successful education because the behaviors aren't sprouting up as they were in the past when we were just looking solely at academics. So everything that we've done, everything that the district has purchased or adopted has been in this line of thinking through the lens of making kids whole children, keeping the behaviors at bay because we are proactive in creating an environment that supports the whole child. It's very exciting work. Thanks, Dave.
Jocelyn and Micah, thank you. And as I shared, it's that engagement piece. It's that engagement. The more we engage kids in the classroom, the more they will, we will see those behaviors decrease that we would typically see in school because kids are just too busy doing those things that they love to do and learning. So I appreciate you sharing that tonight. Next on our agenda, we're going to hear from two of our building leaders. Unfortunately, we're having a little technical difficulty. Ms. McDowell from the high school is not able to log in with us this evening. And so we have Tyler Rush, who's the principal at Slate Ridge Elementary School. We have Brady Harrison, our principal at Wagner Road Junior High School. And then Ms. McDowell had prepared some information, but I'll go through that with you as her slide comes up. But they're going to talk a little bit about positive behavior interventions and supports and what that means in our schools and how we encourage those behaviors we want to see so that we don't have to potentially see those behaviors that deter student learning. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tyler to give us a little brief intro to PBIS and then talk about Slate.
Good evening. Mr. Baker, could you go back one slide?
Oh, sorry about that.
Excellent. So what is PBIS? And so, as Mr. Baker alluded, it's positive behavior interventions and supports. And it's a multi-tiered framework for establishing what we want to see from students when they're here to help them be the most successful that they can be. So if you look at the graphic, you see that as it starts with the most students and the universal supports, and as those supports become bigger and greater and more intensified, less and less students need those things. So what does that look like in the school? And so we really want to work to define and teach what those positive social expectations are, because not all students come to school with those things, just like they don't come with all the academic things that they need. So we have to make sure that we're explicitly teaching what we want to see. And then just like for adults, we want to acknowledge that positive behavior. When your boss tells you you're doing something well, you want to keep doing that. And that's the same for kids. So we make sure that we reward and encourage the things that we want to see instead of looking to punish the things that we don't. We also want to be consistent in our consequences so that students know what to expect when they're at school and understand that if we don't rise to the level that we want to see, that those consequences may come, but they understand what those will be, and those can be consistent and realistic. The biggest piece, one of the most important pieces of PBIS, is data collection. And we want to make sure that we're looking at how we're making decisions and how those decisions are affecting our students and our community as a whole. So we look at what we're doing well and maybe some things where we need to grow, and we use that data to continue to build and grow and put new things in place year over year. And then we talked a little bit about that continuum of, we start with everyone and we get more specific as those needs increase. So if we can go to the next slide, Mr. Baker, I want to talk a little bit about what we do at Slate Ridge. And these are not Slate Ridge only things. These happen in a lot of our elementary buildings that you would see across the state. But we start with that tier one, universal supports, all students. These are things that everybody gets. So a pillar to PBIS is that common building language. And so in our building at Slate, we've selected respectful, responsible, and ready. And you'll hear those words throughout our language with students in setting expectations. What does it look like to be respectful in the cafeteria? How are you responsible when you're in the hallway or taking a restroom break? What does it mean to be ready when you're in the classroom and working on academic or social tasks? We want to, again, teach and review those expectations for all parts of our building. So some of the ways that we achieve that is at the very beginning of the year. And again, we have it coming up here as we return from winter break. We do something called PBIS stations, where we take our students to different areas of the school, and we have teachers ready to lead conversations and model and practice what it looks like, when you're going through the lunch line, or when you're waiting in the bus line, or when you're taking a class restroom break, or when you're walking down the hallway. What does that look like? What are the things we want to avoid? What are the things we want to see? We also have tier one supports from our school counselor, Mrs. Miller. She is in every classroom and teaching a curriculum of supports for things that, at age specific or student specific levels. So what it looks like in a kindergarten classroom may be a very different lesson on the same concept in a fourth grade class. Like we talked about, we want to make sure we're rewarding that positive behavior and telling kids the things that we want to see more of those. So we do that here at Slate through our Rise dollars, our We Rise and Cafeteria Rise. The Rise dollars are individual. So students get little dollars, they're school money basically, and they can spend those in our Toucan school store. So this went digital when COVID started, and we've actually kept that because it's to be honest, just really cool. The kids get to go online, they shop, and they create their wish list of things that they would like to purchase with their Rise dollars. And then those get delivered in little bags with a receipt. It's got a little Amazon smile on it. It's really neat. And the kids get super excited about that. And they get that instant gratification of the recognition of their behavior, but then they have the opportunity to save and grow and then see what that behavior leads to in physical things. We also have that classroom reward and recognition. So our We Rise, those are tickets that classes can earn from other staff members in the building. So teachers can't give it to their own class. They have to earn that from others seeing their class meeting those expectations, and they can earn things throughout the year, and that builds things like extra recess or all the way up to pizza parties. And then we also do a similar thing in our cafeteria where we set a new goal every 2 weeks, and we use our Cafeteria Rise tickets. Individual students earn those for meeting the expectation of that 2-week cycle, and they go to a total for their class, and the class in each grade level earns a reward. So that's a recognition. They get a big poster they put on their door so everybody knows that they're the best class in 4th grade. And then they also get to choose an experience that they get to do with their teacher. So that could be extra gym time, or playing a game of bingo, or a dance party in their classroom. We had one teacher 2 weeks ago who told her kids that if they earned it, they could pie her in the face. So they did that in the cafeteria on a layer of plastic. So the kids really got a kick out of that. So as we move past those things that we're doing for all students, we get into some of the things that would be necessary for a smaller group of students. One of those programs that we have is check-in, check-out. And it's something that we're really proud of here, and it has been very successful for our students. So our students have a mentor, another adult or teacher in the building that is not their classroom teacher, and they check in every morning with them. They go and see them, they talk about their goals for the day, and each student has specific goals that they're working on based on their behavior and academic needs. But they look at those behaviors, the things we want to see, and then we track that throughout the day. And we use that through happy faces or a number scale. And then at the end of the day, they check back in with that mentor, or check out, excuse me. And they talk about how their day went, and did they meet their goal? And sometimes they'll earn incentives from that person. And then we track that data to see how that student's doing. Do we need to increase our expectation? Do we need to change our goals? And then the goal is for students to graduate. And when they do, we make a big deal about that. They get to have McDonald's in the lunchroom or in the the office with the principals, and we celebrate that, and we make sure their parents know about it. So it's really cool to see. We also go into more individual behavior plans and in-class incentives, finding out what motivates students. And at the elementary level, it runs the gamut. So a little bit of extra computer time, or the opportunity to play with the best Play-Doh toy. Or I have a student who the other day worked because they wanted to have 10 minutes with their shoes off in class, and that was the biggest motivator for them, and it worked. We also do small group sessions with our counselor, Mrs. Miller. So she works with our teachers to identify students that may need some extra support in social skills, coping skills, sometimes grief or loss. And she pulls those students into groups and to work with students from other classes, so they have an opportunity to build some of those. And then we're also working to build some mentor programs within our building to work with identified students. Right now we're working to build something with our high school student athletes, where they get to come down and get a glimpse, have our kids get a glimpse of what's happening beyond the elementary level, and what things go on in the rest of our district. And then beyond tier 2, you get into tier 3, and that's where we get, a very few amount of students, but for those students that tier 2 is not meeting all of their needs. So we have great partnerships, and I think we're going to hear a little bit more later tonight about Nationwide Children's Hospital and the supports they provide in our schools. We also at Slate Ridge have a partnership with United Methodist Children's Hospital, and they provide behavioral health counseling for not only students, but they work alongside with families, and they can be here for crisis support, individual counseling sessions, and working to build another layer of support for those students and building those skills. We also work with our counselor for individual meetings. We get a little more intense, a little smaller, sometimes one-on-ones. And then beyond that, we really get into the very, very specifics of what a student may need. And that is always different when you're in tier 3. So that could include looking at the function of a behavior, doing functional behavior assessments of why behind the behavior, and creating behavior plans around that. We may refer to additional services within the building or outside of the district. We may decide as a team that evaluation for special education is appropriate at this point, and we may increase some of those counseling support services. So as you can see, it gets smaller and smaller with the group of students, but more intense as it goes along. So it's a little bit about what we do at Slate. Up next, we have Brady Harrison from the middle school.
Thanks, Mr. Rush. Mr. Harrison?
Thank you. At the middle school level, it looks a little bit different than we do it at the younger levels. The PBIS for us, as well as across the district, I can remember the big shift is, I can remember going into many of my classes when I was in school, and you would see 4 or 5 rules that were on the wall. And those rules all had kind of negative connotations: no gum, no disrespect, no horseplay. And really what PBIS does for us, rather than having that approach, we want to really focus on teaching our students, just like we would teach content, just like we would teach expectations in other settings. We want to teach our students what types of behaviors we would like to see. So we have a lot like the younger, we have 4 what we call pillars And we talk about always being respectful, always being responsible, being safe, and being kind. Those are the 4 things when we talk about common language that we discuss a lot here at Wagner Road Junior High. And then just like Mr. Rush had talked about, we try to teach those expectations in a variety of different settings. So although I really like the stations that Mr. Rush was talking about, and that's the first time I had heard about that. I think with our students being a little bit larger in size and with the space, the way that we choose to teach our expectations are through creating different lessons. Some of those lessons might be YouTube videos. Some of those lessons might be a 5 or 6 page PowerPoint slide. But we have a PBIS committee that comes together and creates lessons that our students will see during their homeroom or advisory period. And those lessons combine those 4 pillars that we talked about, as well as different settings. So one of the lessons for the week might be, what's it look like to be respectful in the cafeteria, whether that be cleaning up after yourselves, whether it be pushing in your chair, those types of things. And then the next week we might focus on safety and what it's like to be safe when you're on a bus, or getting on a bus, getting off a bus while you're on the bus, those types of things. So we feel that really is the heart of what our work is, really teaching those positive expectations and modeling those positive expectations for our students. Mr. Rush, I know, talked a little bit about the daily incentives, because that is an important part of this. The important part is when you're seeing someone that's doing something the right way, it's important to reward them, or at least give them that constant reinforcement. But the little bit different there with the middle level, when we talk to our student council, and then I also have a principal advisory committee that I meet with, what we found at this age level is more of their incentive is the larger quarterly incentives. So if you look, you see some of the pictures that are on the screen. We have our winter quarter incentive coming up next week. And really, we have things that are attractive to all different types of people. And we have a full day. If you've earned this large quarterly incentive, we'll have opportunities. There's crafts. We have some dodgeball opportunities. We have movies. We have treats. So it's really, you would be surprised how many of our students throughout the weeks, hey, how am I doing? Am I on track for the quarterly incentive? So that's something that they really look forward to. And we like to reward those students that are consistently doing what we ask and going above and beyond and living up to those expectations. The last thing I want to talk about, which is another big part of what we do with our committee and our PBIS committee, who works extremely hard. If you look at the MTSS, the multi-tiered supports, we try to make that connection, because with multi-tiered supports, that's both academic as well as behavior. And with academics, there are a lot of benchmarks and interventions that are in place for us, meaning, if we have certain test results, that might put a star beside a student that say this student might need academically a little bit more intervention. And then we test them every 2 weeks or every month to see where that progress is. Behavior wise, we have to come up with our own benchmarks and incentives. Or interventions, I'm sorry. So that's what our PBIS committee right now is tasked with. And it's one of the larger tasks that they have, is they're creating those benchmarks of, we look at our discipline data, look at different consequences, and we say, what students would benefit from certain interventions? Students that might have a certain amount of referrals from a teacher? Is it students that might exhibit certain behaviors multiple times in a classroom that have been suspended, and those types of things? And then, so once we have those benchmarks established, we are in the process also of creating those interventions. What interventions would be beneficial? Are they the behavior check-ins where we have a mentor? Is there reflection pieces, restorative circles, those types of things where we can really hone in on some interventions to make sure more and more of our students are exhibiting those expectations of being respectful, responsible, safe, and kind. So I appreciate the time. I will say that both our students and our staff are excited about PBIS, and it is something that we take very seriously here at the middle school level.
Thanks, Mr. Harrison. this information is information that our assistant principal at our Livingston campus at the high school put together. And so I want to make sure that she gets full credit for this information. Yvonne McDowell, I know she is out listening on the YouTube channel right now. And so I want to make sure she gets full credit for the information that I'm going to share and to make sure that she knows that I take full responsibility for your not being able to access the room tonight. So I apologize that you're having to listen in instead of getting to present yourself. But one of the messages that I know she wanted to convey this evening with all of our parents and caregivers out there is that when it comes to the high school level, not only are we really trying to focus on those positive behaviors that we want to see in the high school setting, but also this is our last chance to make sure that students understand those behaviors that that will and will not be acceptable out in the real world once they leave us after graduation. And so high schools kind of take double duty in that, in making sure that not only are they set for learning today, but they're set for success later. And that's part of what she wanted to convey here. Certainly, a lot of what is done at the high school is really focusing again on those expectations around our portrait of a graduate. In terms of trying to connect what's happening in the classroom to the behaviors that we want to see. For example, one of the things that they've done at Livingston recently, November Student of the Month, that those individuals were actually identified using the portrait of a graduate competencies that Dr. Cosgrave and Ms. Conley talked about. Effective communicators were identified as the Student of the Month, and that was part of the criteria for recognizing those students and those behaviors. Again, the high schools try to highlight those positive behaviors that we want to see, recognizing students who have perfect and good attendance or improved attendance. It might be a situation where those kiddos who are coming to school every single day and doing the right thing get to have lunch with the principal, and the principal buys their lunch that day, just to recognize them for doing those things that we want them to see. Also, then certainly modeling those behaviors and those choices that we want to see every single day. Part of what we do when we have to deal with behaviors that might not be conducive to learning is then sitting down upon return when the students come back to us from a suspension and identifying how we could have done things differently and what those expectations will be moving forward, so then that student is set up for success. And the high school does a lot of that modeling of behaviors and helping students to understand what behaviors we want to see in moving forward. Again, the Livingston campus and Summit, for that matter, they both work very hard at identifying the PBIS framework that's going to work well for them, and what those components will be so that students can be set up for success. So again, thanks, Ms. McDowell. Thank you, Mr. Rush. Thank you, Mr. Harrison, for sharing what's happening in your buildings. At this point, I'm going to talk a little bit about our student code of conduct and just what you as parents and caregivers can be looking for, and understand how that document is set up so that you know how to best support your child. Our student code of conduct is found in our student handbook, and that is accessible to all of you via your child's website. So you have an electronic version of it. The student code of conduct is kind of in the back of that handbook, and it is a common document in all of our buildings' handbooks. So you will see the same student code of conduct in all of those different handbooks across the district. That student code of conduct starts with our student bill of rights. It addresses 5 different areas. Certainly we want our students to understand that they have that right to a free public education. That's why we're all here. We are here to make sure that those students have access to that education, and we want them to be successful. As part of that student bill of rights is also helping students understand they have the ability to speak what's on their minds and advocate for what they believe in, and participate in that process. And we want to teach them to do that responsibly. And so that's part of what we see as their rights here. Of course, they also have that right to, being healthy and making sure they have nutrition while at school, and that their personal needs are taken care of while at school. That Bill of Rights addresses fair consequences, so that when behavior issues do arise, that they understand that there are fair consequences that gets assigned to that. And then finally, making sure that they understand that they have a right to that safe, secure, and supportive school environment. We say all the time that safety comes first. Students are not going to be able to learn well unless they're in that safe environment. And so that's part of what we try to do for our kiddos every single day. Once you dig into the student code of conduct a little more, it does outline the purpose of the document, and then the rights and responsibilities of the parties that are involved. It outlines the rights of our students when it comes to student behavior. It outlines the rights of you as parents, guardians, and caregivers. It outlines the rights of our school staff and as well the superintendent. A lot of legal pieces and parts come into play when we get into those rights. And luckily we do have our attorney here who's going to talk with a little bit later about what those rights are. There's also a section on guidelines in the student code of conduct. It addresses requirements and guidelines around discipline and around conduct at school. It does outline the suspension guidelines that we have to follow. Again, all of that is prescribed in Ohio law. And certainly we want to make sure that that is part of that document so that it's easily accessible to everyone. There are also guidelines around when we do have to notify our partners in law enforcement. Certainly if a law is broken while at school, that's part of those guidelines and how we notify them and involve them in that process. And then finally, the district's discipline policy is included in the student code of conduct. That you'll notice as you look at the code of conduct, it's divided into kind of three portions in terms of the violations of the code of conduct. The first section is this level 1 section, which are those more minor offenses in the code of conduct. And I'm not going to read through all of them, but you kind of see how that level 1 is more of those lower level violations that we deal with. Certainly all of these violations can increase if they're repetitive or they're really highly egregious in nature. But those level 1 offenses are the more of those lower level minor offenses that we would see in school. As then we change into level 2, the offenses become just a little more harsh and things that we certainly do not want to see in school. This is the disruption of the school day or school in general, looking at bullying and harassment. Certainly insubordination and disrespect is among this group of violations. And misconduct at events and certainly not only in our building, but outside the building, in our parking lots and on other parts of our property. Also level 2 offenses include things like tobacco and vandalism, threatening behavior that we might see at school, hate speech, misuse of social media, things like that, that we would address in that level 2. Level 3 gets more serious. And like I said, it progresses as you go through those different sections. Level 3 code of conduct violations include assault and bodily injury, includes bringing dangerous weapons to school. It includes drugs and alcohol, fighting, hazing, sexual misconduct, all of those sorts of things, false alarms and those other sorts of behaviors. So those are the level 3 offenses that we would see and we would need to address. Student code of conduct does talk about what constitutes suspendable offenses at school. Certainly out of school suspension is a consequence that we would see when we need to. I always told my students when I was a principal that when dealing with behaviors and assigning consequences, I always wanted to assign the least consequence that I needed to assign that I felt could change that behavior. The last thing I wanted to do was tell a student that they couldn't come to school because I want them there. I want them there with me. I wanted them there learning in my school. However, if I couldn't get behaviors to change, then we would have to address that. We would have to think about something different other than being at school. And so out of school suspension is an option that we as administrators have to turn to from time to time. Certainly we would consider out of school suspension when it's a safety issue and when there's imminent endangerment to those at school or that individual, or if just the behaviors are chronic and extreme in nature, we have to think about doing an out of school suspension. With those out of school suspensions, of course, there are due process rights that are afforded to students and parents. And that's when we would certainly put those processes into play and notify parents and begin bringing them into that conversation. With that, I'm going to turn things over to our external partners who are going to talk a little bit about those due process rights and then those responsibilities on how we can support our kiddos through those behaviors. So our 3 presenters from our external partners, Laura Anthony is one of our legal counselors from the firm Bricker and Eckler. And then we have Eden Mojes and Serena Herman, who are from Nationwide Children's Hospital, who again will talk about some of the supports that can be put in place at home to help students through those behaviors. With that, I think Ms. Anthony, I think you were all set and queued up. Thank you, Ms. Anthony, for being here, and it is all yours.
All right. Can you hear me?
You're good.
Thumbs up. Okay, great. So I was given the task to talk about due process rights. And, that is something that could take an entire day to talk about. But, in 20 minutes, I'm going to give you a high level overview. Dave, I'm not sure, do I have all of the 20 minutes or is it just a part of it?
We are on target for 20 minutes. If you need 25, I'm sure we can make it happen.
Okay, I just wanted to know if I'm the 20 or if the other external partners are also in that 20.
Nope, they've got 20 themselves. You're good to go.
All right. Well, then I will manage my time accordingly. So 20 minutes is not a lot of time to talk about due process rights, but I'm going to give you just a high level overview. What does that mean? What does due process mean? Well, constitutionally, that is something that we think about. I'm a lawyer, so I think about these things in those type of terms, but it's really, when you break it down, it's really three elements. Number one is notice. And notice comes from your code of conduct. What conduct is prohibited in school? And so as you heard earlier in the presentation, the code of conduct is distributed and it specifies what conduct is not allowed in school. And that's distributed through handbooks, through having things online, and it's also made available upon request. So that's element number one of notice. You also have your board policy, which talks about it contains, the expectations for conduct rules, but it also outlines some process requirements, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So it's notice is the code of conduct, and then the second element is an opportunity to be heard. So the opportunity to be heard, we'll talk about that. I'll let you know when we advance the slide. The opportunity to be heard would be through like having a meeting with the principal so that the student can be heard about what happened. So that's number one is notice. Number two is an opportunity to be heard. And number three is an appeal. That's really due process when you break it down. And you're going to see throughout my comments today how those three elements align. So on this slide, this is where we have the student conduct rules. On the next slide, we have information about how far does the jurisdiction of the school extend? Well, this jurisdiction of the school can extend to off-campus misconduct if that misconduct is connected to school activities or the misconduct is directed towards a school employee or their property. There are also situations where the code of conduct can go off campus for things like extracurricular activities. There might be a separate code of conduct provisions related to that. There also might be issues that relate to things that occur that have an effect in school. So some sort of impact. So there might be something that happens with the community that has impact in the school. So you're not looking necessarily where the act occurs, you're looking at the impact. And that happens with bullying, cyberbullying, some other things that are prohibited in your policy. So that's where off-campus misconduct comes into play. But there are a lot of options. And on the next slide, there are just a couple of options that I have listed that the school has to institute type of discipline. And there are certainly things that are not on this list. But some of the more common things are, in-school suspensions. Various schools call it various different things. So it could be an in-school restriction. It could be, assignment to the learning center. So it's a basic restriction while you're still in school, but that doesn't result in an out-of-school removal. So there are things like, some schools have Wednesday school or Saturday school or detentions or other things that restrict a student's participation in their typical school day as a consequence for a code of conduct violation. Then there are things that remove a student totally from the school environment. And that would be something like an emergency removal, which is something that occurs when there is right then and there an immediate danger to persons or property or some ongoing threat of disruption. And so those emergency removal provisions are really there to quell a disturbance or have something that is going to, that is super disruptive happening right then and there. So, and if it's not just an emergency right then and there, If it's something that's more long term, meaning the consequence would be longer term than just getting the student to a safer environment, then the school has the option of a suspension, which is usually something that is less than 10 days. If it is more than 10 days of a removal, we call that an expulsion, and there are different due process requirements for each. Now, there is a provision in the law that allows for a student's permanent exclusion from school, but that is a consequence that is rarely used and often not something that you will see used in schools, because it isn't only the school that does that. There is some element of involvement with the State Department of Education. So let's talk about what's most common. We'll move on to suspensions. So who can suspend a student? It could be the superintendent, it could be a building principal, it could be an assistant principal, or another administrator who's been authorized by your board policy to issue a suspension. So in some schools, there's a dean of students. In some schools, there's other administrators that are called upon to do to perform those roles. On the next slide, we talk about what happens before the suspension. So before a suspension, here are your due process requirements. Remember, I said that there's notice and an opportunity to be heard and an appeal. So here you will see on this slide talking about suspensions. So before a suspension, the student is going to, number one, they're going to know what conduct is prohibited because the code of conduct is posted. It's distributed to parents and students. So there's notice of what conduct is prohibited. There's also notice that the student might be suspended for the suspected conduct. So whatever is come to the attention of the school administrators, they would provide notice of an intended suspension and give the student an opportunity to respond. So if the student has something prohibited in their backpack and there's somebody who heard that the student might be carrying something that is a dangerous item, maybe it's a weapon, maybe it's drugs, and the principal received that information and talks to the student, says, you might be suspended because I've received some information that you are in possession of something prohibited. What do you have to say for yourself? So there's what has happened. The student has received notice of the intended suspension. You might be suspended for this, and they're given an opportunity to respond. Once the principal hears that information, they can determine should the student be suspended or not. If the student is suspended, after that suspension occurs, the student then gets some more notice. They get written notice that they are suspended. So the first notice says you might be suspended, and the second notice says you are suspended. And just like I mentioned the due process requirements before a suspension, now you get written notice of the suspension and you have an opportunity to have an appeal. So that would be an appeal hearing before the Board of Education or the Board of Education's designated hearing officer. And in Reynoldsburg, the Board of Education has designated somebody to conduct those suspension appeal hearings. So those hearings aren't before the full board, it's in front of a designee. And then that designee would make a decision as to whether or not the student should be suspended from school. That decision would then be final. And further appeals could be made to the Common Pleas Court in Franklin County. So that's suspension in a nutshell. Let's move on to expulsions. Just like those notices and opportunities to be heard and the appeal rights, those things also occur if the student is removed from school for more than 10 days, and that would be any expulsion. Before that expulsion would occur, the student would receive written notice that they may be expelled. And then they would have an opportunity to appear before the superintendent's designated hearing officer to explain their conduct, to explain what happened, and to offer reasons why the student should not be expelled. That hearing has to occur under the statute no sooner than 3 and no later than 5 school days after the notice is given, unless there's been a request to, shorten or extend that timeline. So if your student is up for an expulsion, you will receive an invitation to come to this hearing. And if you can't make it on the day that the hearing is scheduled, you can request, but the law requires that it be scheduled within a certain period of time. So that hearing is held. And information is shared with the hearing officer. And then ultimately, the superintendent will make a decision as to whether or not the student should or should not be, whether or not the student should be expelled. Once that decision is made, what happens? And on the next slide, we have that if a student is expelled, then the student gets some more information. So that would be the written notice that the student is expelled, and then information about the right to an appeal. And again, just like suspensions, the student and the family can appeal to the Board of Education's designated hearing officer to offer reasons why the expulsion was not appropriate and be heard, just in terms of an explanation. If the student is expelled for more than 20 days, the notice has to also have information about agencies that can provide assistance in improving the student's behavior that led to that expulsion. So that's another resource that is given to students. And I'm expecting that the other external partners that are going to talk about some of those resources. So another thing I wanted to mention about expulsions is what happens if a student during this process withdraws. And that's on the next slide. If the parents and the student decide we're going to withdraw and the student is no longer going to be a student in this particular school district, can we just, not go forward with the expulsion process? And I wanted to include here information so that everybody has a shared understanding that by law, the district is required to move forward and do its hearing and issue an expulsion and issue whatever consequence would have been imposed had the student not withdrawn from school. And that is just a requirement of the law to ensure that if a student were to try to go to another school district, they would have information that the student had some behavioral challenges and could have been up for expulsion. So that is something that is in there, and the district doesn't have a lot of discretion in that regard. How long can an expulsion be? Well, typically an expulsion would be any range from 11 days to 80 days. However, there are certain circumstances, and on the next slide, I've listed them, where the student can be expelled for 1 calendar year. And these are the things that are, behaviors that are going to cause a significant safety concern in the school. So students who possess firearms or knives, or they engage in behavior that would cause serious physical harm to persons or property, some sort of behavior of violence, or they participate in a bomb threat. And so the board policy, as well as the state law, authorizes an expulsion for up to 1 calendar year in those circumstances. So that's the range. There are also some special circumstances that I wanted to mention that I don't have time to go through today, but there are some special circumstances that protect students the young students, those students who are in pre-K to 3rd grade. There are several different laws that protect students with disabilities from having interruptions in their education. And there are also protections that are afforded students who are accused of Title IX violations. And what that means, Title IX violations are incidents where there could be an allegation of sexual harassment or sexual assault. And a lot of these special circumstances relate to safety as well as due process. So for those pre-K to 3rd grade students, there are limited situations where a student can be removed from school, but the circumstances when they can do relate to safety. So weapons, things like that, violent acts, things that cause harm to other students. Those would be situations where those students might be removed. But there are also situations where if there's going to be a removal, the school wants to make sure that mental health needs are ultimately considered. So there is coordination and consultation with mental health providers when there is a concern in that regard. Similarly, with students with disabilities, the law provides that students with disabilities cannot be removed for behavior that is caused by or had a direct and substantial relationship to the child's disability. So if somebody has a behavioral issue that is caused by a disability, the school has to follow certain procedures to explore the relationship between the behavior and the disability and determine that causal connection. And so those are additional procedures that are put into play when the student is identified as a child with a disability. And then finally, with Title IX, there were new rules that were issued in August of 2020 that provide enhanced due process procedures for individuals who are accused of committing sexual harassment or sexual assault. And so if you see a situation involving any of these things, know that all of the things that I talked about earlier in my presentation apply, but then there are additional procedures that apply. So it doesn't look as simple as the due process procedures that I mentioned. So that's the end of my planned talking points. Dave, was there anything else that you thought I should mention?
No, you did a great job, Ms. Anthony. Thank you so very much. And I can't reiterate enough to our audience at home how suspension and expulsion is such a tough conversation to have. One, because there's all the legal aspects and it's so technical in nature. But two, it just goes against what we believe in as educators. We want our kiddos to be in school and we want them to be engaged and in class and learning and preparing for their future. And so suspension and expulsion is, I always think, is the last resort of things that we want to have to face as administrators. However, we'll face it and we'll deal with it if it means that we need to maintain that safe environment for kids. And so it is a tool that we can use and do use in order to maintain safety for all students in our school. And so we're willing to do it. It's just not the piece of our job that we certainly look forward to having to do. So again, Ms. Anthony, thank you for sharing your expertise tonight and being a part of our conversation. Along with those rights is, of course, become great responsibilities. And this is where we're going to turn to some of our partners at Nationwide Children's Hospital to talk with our parents and caregivers out there in the listening audience about how they can support their kiddos when they are dealing with behaviors that are being displayed at school and potential consequences tied to those behaviors. We are so fortunate to have Nationwide Children's Hospital in our backyard, and then certainly fortunate to have them right here in Reynoldsburg City Schools as a part of our partnership and learning community. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Eden Moges and Serena Herman from Nationwide Children's Hospital to share some tips and tools for you as parents and caregivers in supporting your children through these difficult times of dealing with behavior.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Dr. Brown, for inviting us as Nationwide Children's Hospital to provide this important presentation to the parents. As Laura had stated, we could go on forever talking about this, but we wanted to focus on some specifics to support you. But if you have more questions or if you need anything, always feel free to reach out to your school counselor and your school staff, and they will connect with us. But we want to first start by saying that some of the things we're going to talk about will be challenging to some families and just trying to figure out answers as you guys dealing with so many systemic barriers. So be mindful that we're going to be talking about sensitive topics, be supportive of others, and take care of your own needs. So as you have received so much information, the thing to ask yourself is that now what? What do you do at home? What do you do? How do you work with the school? How do you help your children, no matter what age they are, preschool all the way to almost ending in high school? The goal for us is to look at how do you create a safe and predictable environment? Being a predictable schedule, this could be verbal and written, depending on your age, the child of your age and their needs. And talk about warning of changes in the schedule. So if the school's having a half a day, if there's things at home, depending on who's going to pick up the child, if it's the bus, if it's whatever it is. Communicate that with your child. Have clear expectations. Post rules and expectations and go over them daily. It could be redundant and boring for some kids, but going over the rules daily before different activities, rules that involves home and school is crucial. Don't assume because children are older that they should know. Just give them the information. Engage your child in what his expectation should be at home and school. Keep the expectations consistent. So if your child telling you that no, I could do this at school. You could, follow up with their teachers, make sure that you're able to communicate with them and the rules again are consistent. Practice safe strategies before crisis happens. We've noticed this a lot that some of us, we get so busy, we become reactive. So how do we become proactive? By practicing situations. And if you notice your child needs sensory materials or calming down spots, even ongoing mindfulness practices and brain breaks, make sure you collaborate and communicate with your school staff if this is what benefits your child. And addressing uncertainty. You have to figure out how to make your child's, their schedule, their day, their situations as we live in this unpredictable environment with everything's happening around us. How do we create, let, encourage, and emphasize all the needs that they have? When we talk about make informed decisions about what your child needs to know to feel safer. And this, again, differs by age and developmental stages. Create an environment where your child can ask questions. They should be able to be asking any kind of questions. And if you don't have the answer, make sure you let them know, I don't have the answer right now, but I'm happy to find ways to get the answers for you. Let your child know they're going to be safe and you will support them in that area. Encourage compassion for other family members and students. This is really important. Encouraging your child, your student to have compassion for other students. And I would include their teachers as well. Be patient with teachers, teaching them compassion. That would be important. Emphasize that feeling down and scared is part of being human. You could even talk to them about how you feel scared sometimes. We all need help each other and feel safer. And Serena will take the next slide.
So some warning signs and behaviors to look out for, especially if conflict arises, whether it be at home or school, looking at warning signs of, okay, when do I step in? So if we're noticing some negative social media posts, so sometimes kids may post things on their stories or on their IG lives, and sometimes peers may report back to their parents, and that's how things kind of get around in terms of negative social media posts. Lack of insight into own feelings, behavior, or personality. So children not being able to identify how they feel or what they're feeling. Changes in eating habits and lack of appetite, not caring about learning, friends or school, extreme mood changes. A lot of that all can align with different things to look out for, especially when there's mood changes. So when we talk about extreme mood changes, one day they were perfectly fine and things were good, and then now they're home and they're more isolated, they're locked in their room, they're not talking to anybody, they're not engaging. Some other warning signs to look out for: confused thinking or problems concentrating. Sometimes when conflicts arises, kids typically have that on the forefront of their mind, so they have a hard time concentrating on other things. Feeling excessively sad or low, just experiencing any kind of depression symptoms, excessive anger or bullying. So if they're acting out a little bit more than what they're usually acting out on, or if they start bullying others or bullying siblings more than often, that's another warning sign to look out for. And then also thinking, talking, writing about suicide. So this is a very serious matter that us at Nationwide Children's Hospital take very seriously. Anytime a child mentions anything along the lines of, I wish I were dead, or I wish I wasn't here anymore, or I wish I wasn't alive. Sometimes we may hear things in terms of, I wish that I could just fall asleep and never wake up again. Those are all serious things to look out for and keep an eye on. And then sometimes they might even have physical symptoms or warning signs. So somatic complaints such as headaches, stomach aches, a lot of those kind of fall in line with anxiety symptoms. So a lot of times kiddos will experience a lot of anxiety where they feel sick to their stomach, they can't concentrate, they start getting migraines. But overall, these are all really good warning signs to look out for and behaviors to look out for, especially when a crisis is about to occur or any conflict is happening, whether at home or at school. Next, we want to talk about teaching conflict resolution and critical thinking to your kids. So understanding their own and others' feelings. So sometimes kids may have a hard time understanding why they're feeling or what they're feeling, or maybe they might be experiencing a feeling that they've never had before. A lot of times we have kiddos who experience grief for the first time and they have no idea why. Sometimes when we talk about grief, we automatically think about death and dying, but a lot of times kids may also experience grief when they lose a friend, friend, or when a friend no longer wants to be around them, or if a friend moves away. Sometimes we also encourage helping them brainstorm a healthy solution. So sometimes kiddos may result to, oh, I'm going to fight her, I'm going to hit her, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z to them. But when this type of conversation comes out, maybe redirecting and helping them brainstorm a healthier solution, as in, let's get an adult involved. Who is a support person that you can go to at school? Who is someone that you feel safe around talking about this? Helping them focus on the problem and not the individual. So focusing more so on what the conflict may be, and also teaching them conflict resolution skills, and also modeling empathy. So sometimes we like to think that it starts at home. So as parents, modeling empathy to children can definitely help them take that to school, take that to work, wherever they may be, especially when getting into conflict or experiencing any kind of crisis. Helping them understand why they should take responsibility for their actions. So there's a really big accountability piece that we like to talk to kiddos about. So taking accountability for their actions, taking accountability for things that they say. I know a lot of the times kiddos may act in the heat of the moment or say things that they don't mean, and helping them and teaching them, how can we move forward from this? How can we effectively communicate surrounding this situation? As Eden mentioned before, reviewing home rules, but also reviewing school rules. So obviously going over expectations at home. Sometimes kiddos may say, well, when I'm at this friend's house, they let me do this there. Or when I'm sleeping over at so-and-so's house, their parents allow us to stay up till 3 a.m. And just kind of reiterating those expectations both at home and at school. And lastly, encouraging them to problem solve with school staff. So a lot of kiddos are spending most of their days at school, or having them or helping them identify what adult in the school building do they have a good rapport with, what is a school staff member that they feel like they can trust and talk to when they're having issues or problems at school. But these are all really good ways of teaching your children about conflict resolution and critical thinking. When we talk about getting kiddos to talk, especially when we get into the teenage years. So we see a lot of the times when middle school and high school hits, a lot of times we'll find some kiddos where we check in with them and we'll say, hey, how was school today? You'll get the answer, fine. They walk away. Hey, what did you have for lunch today? Grilled cheese. Walk away. Sometimes we'll even get to the point where we ask kiddos, hey, name one thing that you really enjoyed or your favorite part of school today. And sometimes we'll get the answer, recess and lunch, walks away. So we want to really encourage those conversations at home. So a lot of children may believe they shouldn't show their emotions to be strong. And sometimes they may answer questions or ask questions that can't be answered with yes, no, or I don't know. So a lot of times when kids believe that, showing emotion or talking about feelings makes them feel weak, encouraging them that it doesn't make them feel weak at all. And taking it from a strengths-based approach. So when your child is experiencing conflict, whether it be at home or school, asking them, what do you feel like you have control over? Who do you ask for help? What are the school rules? Did you speak to a teacher about this? Did you speak to a school staff member about this? Tell me what has been the hardest part for you. And these are all really good examples of ways to engage in that conversation, especially when it comes to kiddos feeling bullied at school, kiddos getting into any kind of conflict with other peers at school. These are all really good conversation starters to have with children.
And so here's one of my favorite things that I teach children. And it's really important that you try to make a list of all these things you could do at home. If your kids don't have access to these resources, it's figuring out how do we get these resources to them. And again, that's by, you could always reach out to your Reynoldsburg school counselors and we could get you some of these resources. Protective factors is what everybody needs to have in order to deal with daily situations that arise in crisis and stressful times. And one of the things we look at is having high self-esteem. Also emotional regulation abilities. And emotional regulation abilities is really just how do we regulate ourselves? How do we bring ourselves back to be able to think clearly, to follow our family's rules or to follow the school rules because we are under duress? Good coping and problem solving skills are always important. And then a sense of belonging in school, community, spiritual, and all cultural as well. We have kids that are involved in multiple activities, and with everything going on, and some areas are open, some areas are closed, is really figuring out how do we connect our kids to the activities that mean something to our families. So if your kids are not in any sports, that's fine, but maybe they're connected to a neighbor, to a grandparent, to a cousin, or just to you. That's really crucial that they feel like they belong with someone and to something. Rules and limits set in the home. Again, that goes back to what we spoke to earlier and what Serena had mentioned, consistency, structure, talking about it could be your rules, school rules, a limit that you set in your home. Clear expectations and structured environments is crucial for kids, especially kids and who are struggling, who are really going under some extreme tension, who seems like they're not listening, who seems like they just want to do their own thing. This is when the structured environments matters. Supportive relationship with family members, presence of mentors, role model. And a mentor or a role model doesn't have to be from some agency. It could be someone that you trust. It could be someone, an uncle. It could be a cousin. It could be from any kind of organization that you belong to. As long as this person you trust and they are closely related to your values. That's really important. And then physical and psychological safety is really important for kids to feel that if you're able to, if you don't have the resources and, with all the systemic barriers that's happened, if you're struggling, again, reach back out to your school to support you. There's a lot of resources that if there's any needs in your home, that they can provide you those information. Adequate housing. Again, if you need support, you reach back out and we could get you those resources and support that you need. Access to healthcare is crucial for kids. I don't know if David had mentioned that we have the clinic now at the Livingston campus, and that is where you could get the access to healthcare, and we could provide you support in that area. And then positive self-talk. One of the things when I'm working with kids, I constantly ask them, when you look in the mirror, what do you see? Tell me 3 positive things that you see in the mirror. And this is how we get kids to start thinking about positive things about themselves. And it's not always materialistic things that they could see, but it could be also the way they think. They're such a good friend, they're trustworthy. Those are important protective factors. And then why is it important to help your kids connect? We had talked earlier about connecting to someone, and it could be someone as long as you trust is important. But Bruce Perry is one of my favorite child psychiatrists. If you get a chance, read his books. But he has a quote that this says, there is no more effective neurobiological intervention than a safe relationship. And some of those safe relationships could come from school. I'm looking at these kids in the hallways and they are so close to their teachers. They're always telling me who they care about, their mentors, it could be the librarian, it could be any staff members at the school that they care about. Relationship bring our brain back into regulation. Again, back into that regulation where we know and understand and we could think clearly about what we need to do. Remember to connect before you redirect. Sometimes when we're really frustrated, it's hard for us to figure out, okay, how do I breathe and connect with my child because I need to tell them what to do. Having a trusted adult is significant to building resiliency. It models co-regulation. During times of crisis, many communities look for helpers for support. That helper could be in your school as well and in your community. And you could be their main source of support and information. And we'll talk a little bit about making sure that you also are not burned out by constantly giving and caring. You can help with providing some normalcy, especially in these trying times, structured and providing resources and information, and be creative and flexible with strategies. And here is where you could be the change. This is hard because sometimes you feel like, how can I be a change? I can't even get my kids to listen. I'm so busy. I have so many things to do. But kids really look at you, even if you don't think they are. You mean the world to your kids. They're not going to show it all the time because they forget that you were once a child or a teenager. Even when you say, when I was a kid, they just don't even want to hear that. But again, they're still looking at you. And it helps to know someone is thinking about them. And that's really important. Even if you could say like, tell me the best thing about your day. You know, one of our favorite words, most parents will say, how was your day? I would say try to change that. Instead of say, how was school? Just ask them, what was the best thing about school today? And then this way they're able to answer something. Even if they say lunch to you every day, that's fine. Just say, what'd you have for lunch? What was about lunch? Tell me about the duty aid. Just keep the conversation going. Offer choices on self-comment strategies. Some things may have worked with you and some things may have worked with them or their peers, but you could also get resources from their teachers. And we'll also, at the end of the slide, we'll give you some information on how to get more resources for self-comment strategies. Practice active listening. I'm going to slow down on this one just because it's really important. You know, I'm a parent as well, and then suppressing the urge to correct them instead of using curiosity and validation around all emotions they're experiencing. This is where you can further connection. It's really hard when kids are saying, so-and-so is bothering me, or my teacher's not listening. You just want to give them advice. You want to tell them what worked. But really try to suppress that urge. Even if just for 10 minutes, 5 minutes, if you could just pause and say, tell me more, or tell me what did you do about it, or what did your friend do about it in the classroom? Even if they say, I don't know, try to push a little bit before you just jump in and give them advice, because this is how we grow the critical thinking part. Demonstrate empathy and validation. Be consistent with expectations and behavior plans that are based on rewards, not punishment. Collaborative problem solving. And this doesn't just have to be with your child. It could be with a teacher as well. If your child is saying something that they notice at school, something's happening, connect with the teacher and the school council and see how you guys can come up with a solution. Save consequences and debriefing for later. In the moment, if something is happening, as soon as they get in and they see you and they want to tell you everything's going on, again, suppress the urge to correct them, listen to them, and just talk about the consequences a little bit later so this will help them come up with solutions. I'm going to jump. Let's say we're going to jump to this one.
In terms of how to provide support, this go into a little bit more specifics of how to provide that support. So like Eden said, really suppress that urge of wanting to correct them, wanting to tell them what to do, wanting to give them the advice. As a therapist, that's an urge that I have sometimes as well. So tell me more. That's one of my favorite things to ask kiddos, especially when, you know, they're talking about their day or who's bothering them. But in terms of how to provide support, make sure that you're being specific and ask permission to provide advice. I know it can sound weird asking your own child for permission to provide advice, but sometimes that also gives them like a feeling of autonomy. I apologize, my dog sees a UPS man. But sometimes kiddos, although that sounds weird, sometimes that gives kiddos the feeling of, wow, they want to hear me, or they're asking me if it's okay. Another thing that you can do is, are there other dynamics that are or could exacerbate the conflict? So what are the triggers? What are things that are causing them to feel this certain way? What are some things that they can think of that may have caused this conflict? Again, don't always try to fix it, have them brainstorm an answer. So this leads back to, you know, suppressing those urges. So helping them brainstorm and, you know, having a conversation together in terms of, you know, what are the next steps? Tell me more about what's going on. Tell me what you would do in this situation. How to respond to urgent concerns of child safety immediately. So obviously, if there's any kind of safety concern or urgent concern, you know your child best. So if you feel like taking them to the hospital would be a good idea, or, you know, touching base with school admin or a teacher first thing in the morning is a good idea. We always urge parents that you know your child best. So whatever you feel is you're most comfortable with or is the best response in terms of conflict, we just encourage you to do so. And lastly, emotional check-ins. So obviously, you know, when kiddos and teens get into conflict with friends or things come about at school, it does really bring up a lot of emotions. And sometimes they may not show it at home, or sometimes they may not talk about it at all. We talk about how kiddos tend to internalize a lot. So something that I do with a lot of my clients is we talk about internalizing. When kiddos keep emotions in, it's almost like a balloon. And I ask them, what happens when you blow into a balloon and you keep blowing and keep blowing? Eventually it's going to pop, right? So when it comes to emotions and feelings, when kiddos internalize a lot, it just stacks and stacks and stacks. And then eventually it's going to get to a breaking point where they may feel like they're about to explode. So sometimes doing something as simple as, hey, how are you doing? Or, hey, how's your day going? And maybe following up with, how are you really feeling? Because sometimes kids hear it all the time, whether it's from other parents, other teachers. And, the simple answer is, I'm doing well, or I'm doing good. And maybe just checking in on them on another level in terms of asking them, how are you really feeling? May open up an avenue of a different type of conversation with them. Self-care, my favorite thing to talk about. So as parents, I would love, love, love to hear about what you all are doing to take care of yourself as well. A lot of the times there's a saying that I live by, especially when I work with children: you can't pour from an empty cup. So as parents, I'm sure you give and give and give, and we want to make sure that you're not at a point where you're feeling burnt out. So making sure that your physical environment has an impact on your attitude, your mood, and behavior, making sure that you're creating a space that is calming and not triggering for you. So maybe decluttering, organizing, minimizing potential triggers that might be around you, putting up pictures and artwork, or changing lighting in your office space or space that you do work in, or adding a little bit of background music. Those can all really add to a really healthy space for you in terms of taking care of yourself. Making sure that you're collaborative instead of confrontational with your kids in your environment. So again, avoiding power struggles, having that conversation and suppressing that urge to want to give them the advice and telling them what to do. Making sure to have clear, direct, and transparent communication, having easy access to items that regulate you and your child to connect with. I know these poppets are a new thing, the bubble poppers, fidget spinners, stress balls, anything and everything under the sun that you can think that you and your child could take just a few moments to just sit in peace and quiet and play with your poppets or fidget spinners or stress balls, whatever it may be. Utilizing a trauma-informed lens when interacting with others. Being consistent and predictable. So having daily routines and agendas or schedules so you and your child know what to expect. So kind of going back to what Eden had spoke about setting schedules. If something changes in their daily schedule, if they have a doctor's appointment coming up, making sure that they know ahead of time. Kids will do well if they can, and so will adults. So believe others are doing the best they can in that moment, and finding what you have control over and starting there. A lot of the times when things pile up, as parents, I'm sure you are, in a position to think, I have so much on my plate, I don't know where to start, I don't know where to go from here. And obviously giving yourself that grace to identify what you do have control over versus what you don't, and just starting there. And then lastly, I won't go into detail with all of these scenarios, but these are all student scenarios in terms of how to go about conflict that may arise, whether at home or at school. And I'm going to go in on the middle one here because I like to pick on Eden. But the scenario is, Eden is a 9-year-old girl in 3rd grade who struggles with impulse control surrounding electronics. One day, Eden saw her teacher's cell phone sitting on her desk. While the teacher got up to help another student, Eden sneaks up to her desk and steals the phone and puts it in her pocket. When her teacher asks the class where the phone went, Eden blamed another student. After the teacher searched everyone's desk, Eden is sent to the principal's office and gets a phone call home. Eden could have told the truth at the very start and avoid getting twice the amount of consequences if she continued to be dishonest. This is definitely a really big lesson that I like to teach a lot of my students as well, especially when it comes to integrity and dishonesty. So a lot of times, especially in the teenage years, teens tend to think that they can get away with lying their way out of things. And this is not saying all teens, but there are some teens out there that feel that they can lie their way out of situations or lie their way out of consequences. And I like to put it into perspective for them in terms of, would you rather tell the truth and get the consequence right then and there? Or would you rather try to lie your way out of it, and then maybe a couple days down the road, mom and dad figure out what happened, and then you're now getting twice the consequence of what it could be? A lot of these other scenarios on here just kind of list out some different situations and scenarios that could happen at school. And so like the first one that talks about physically reacting. So if a student starts to kick another classmate because he felt embarrassed. So instead of reacting physically, what could have AJ done instead? This last one over here, Barry, the 15-year-old student who had liked another student who they felt is going out with someone else. They reached out to the individual on social media and started saying mean things about them. So in the world we live in today, social media is a huge, huge factor as to a lot of the conflicts and fights that occur between peers and their friends. So they shared the mean texts and tweet with other students. So screenshotting, that's a huge one. Kids will screenshot anything and everything, and things will spread like wildfire. Making sure that you have a conversation with your child about what can you do instead, or what can we do to move forward from this. Obviously, we always like to encourage, getting an adult into the mix or making sure that the school is aware. But these are all different types of scenarios that are real life scenarios for sure, of ways you can handle the situation and talk to your child about different types of conflicts and things that are going on at school.
And can I add to this scenario, David, if you could go back? First of all, the names are not real. Just wanted to say that clearly. And secondly, these are the scenarios you can use at home with your child. If your child said, this doesn't happen in my world, ask them for a situation that happened in their school. It doesn't have to be them. If they notice their friend or something's going on in social media, and then ask them how they would resolve it. Try to role play some of these things at home. And this is how we become proactive with situations. So if you're reading some of these scenarios based on their age and they're thinking this is silly, just have them come up with ideas. It's really hard to tell them when you were in high school or what you dealt with. Again, they don't always see us as teenagers or young people. They just see you as a parent. And so if you're a guardian, a grandparent, whoever is raising this child, just try to connect with them, but be where they are. Ask them for some scenarios and really encourage you to role play some of these activities so they could come up back to that critical thinking and problem solving, helping them problem solve. And so remember, when we talk about trauma, you hear that word a lot, but trauma doesn't make it okay for kids to behave poorly. But understanding its effects can help us respond to challenging behaviors in more effective ways. So this truly means that we're not excusing kids from their behaviors at all. We're not saying, oh, this kid should not be getting in trouble or getting these consequences, but it's really understanding where they're coming from. And if they are really dealing and struggling with trauma, this is where you could reach out again back to your school staff to see how you could connect them with the resources that they need. And also talking about yourself. I know we as parents, we want to advocate for our children, but figuring out how to also advocate for yourself. The picture here, if you look at it, I need a break. Take one. It's simple as that, but it's really not simple at times because as you notice, we're here late talking about important things and you are there paying attention to this. It's important. But again, figuring out when is it the right time to take a break, figuring out what you need. Let people know how to help. And taking breaks. And so, for example, if you're talking to your child and you can't get through to them and you don't know the answers, reach out to their teachers, reach out to their school counselors. The school has done an excellent job having resources for you so you don't have to do it alone. And so they could give you some talking points and providing you support. And then advocating for others, and that could be your child, and it could be even for teachers, is how do you advocate for them? Ask other people how they're doing. And that's important. And that could be your friend, people in your social circle, asking them how they do it. Spend more time listening, and kindness goes a long way. And so when we talk about resources, aside from the wonderful school staff that you have, if it's your teachers, school counselors, the school that could provide your resources, we at Nationwide Children's Hospital have a free resource. It's evidence-based for you. You don't have to, but you could always sign up from there. You could learn, you could educate yourself. This is something that we really worked hard at the hospital. We wanted to make sure that families have the resources, including teachers, to how to speak to kids, how to connect with them, not knowing what to say, but these resources is for anybody that wants it. Again, it's on oursleeves.org. You may have seen some of those slogans out there, but this is just for all of you guys to have some conversation starters, to figure out what do I need, and then to also understand when is it a mental health, when is it serious versus just my kid going through something basic that I can handle. But this is a place also where you can get resources. And so this is Serena's information. We are really just how grateful and thankful for the school to give us this opportunity to speak to you. But again, always reach out to your school staff. But if you have questions, this is our information. You could always reach out to us and we'll try to get as much information to you as we can.
Well, thank you all so much to all of our presenters who are still on with us this evening. To the parents and caregivers, I know we've shared a lot of information with you tonight, and certainly it's a lot to digest. We will post this presentation, so here in the next couple of days, so that you have access to the information and you'll have that contact information if you need to reach out. I'm very grateful to our partners at Nationwide Children's for the information and sharing, always trying to strengthen our partnership between the school and parents and the community, because that's how we wrap around and take care of kids here in Reynoldsburg. And so I really appreciate you being involved in that. Certainly to our partner at Bricker and Eckler, Laura Anthony, for sharing her expertise around due process tonight. Very appreciative to all of our internal stakeholders as well, who presented, our two building leaders, and Ms. McDowell, who was listening at home for her preparation tonight, Dr. Cosgrave and Ms. Conley for your work around the academic content standards and the Portrait of a Graduate. And finally, expressing my gratitude to Dr. Brown for always helping to frame these conversations and promote these powerful, strong dialogues with our parents and caregivers out there. Again, we will post this shortly so that you'll have access to it, and please share it. We'll post the presentation, the audio part on our website as well, so that if you have friends out there who wanted to be with us tonight, weren't able to join us, they can access it. With that, we're going to draw tonight to a close. A reminder that students are in school through next Thursday, and then they start their winter break from that point. Teachers and principals will be in through next Friday, and then we'll be off for winter break. And so we'll be back in 2022. I can't believe we're saying that already. Thank you all so very much again, and have a safe winter break. Again, appreciate your attendance. Good night.